Ozymandias is one of the most well-known poems in the Power and Conflict anthology, and this video will teach you everything you need to know about it for your exams. Keep an eye out for key quotes to memorize, and be sure to take lots of notes. Let's get started with some context to give you a better idea of what this poem is trying to say. Written by the acclaimed poet Percy Bysshe Shelley in the early 1800s, Ozymandias is a sonnet which tells the story of a traveler who came across a crumbling statue of an ancient Egyptian pharaoh, half buried in the sand. Beyond the surface narrative, however, it is really meant to get us thinking about the unstoppable passage of time and the fleeting nature of human ambition. Shelley was quite the radical thinker of his age, who was anti-monarchy, an atheist, and a pacifist, so his personal beliefs deeply influenced his writing. At the time he wrote this poem, a statue of the title character Ozymandias had just been discovered and was being transported to the British Museum. Ozymandias was also known as Ramses II, who reigned during the 13th century BCE and was famous for his ambitious building projects and military campaigns. He was also quite the tyrant, and since Shelley was notably anti-monarchist, it is not a far stretch to assume that his portrait of the downfall of Ozymandias was also a not-so-subtle dig at the British monarchy, exposing the arrogance of rulers who believed their empires would last forever, but eventually crumbled to dust and were forgotten. Shelley's beliefs and writing were right at home at this period of time, which was known as the Romantic era, an artistic movement that was often anti-authority, celebrated nature, and challenged traditional conventions in art and literature. Looking at the structure of Ozymandias, we can see that this is reflected in the poem because it is presented as a sonnet with 14 lines mainly written in iambic pentameter, but it does not strictly follow either of the classic Shakespearean or Petrarchan rhyme schemes. Instead, it mixes elements of them both together, creating a disruptive new type of sonnet that reflects the broken and fragmented image of the statue. This was a purposeful choice by the author to challenge the expected sonnet conventions and reinforce the poem's main message, that the works of man are temporary, whether it be Shakespeare's sonnet form or Ramses' statues. To build on this idea further, Shelley uses breaks in the lines called caesura, as well as enjambment, which means carrying over a sentence to the next line of the poem without using a full stop or a comma to give a pause. This creates an irregular rhythm that makes it feel unstable, again to show that literary traditions are crumbling, just like the statue. You might also notice that the story is told in an unusual way, through the speaker who is retelling what he heard from a traveler rather than seeing it himself. This layered narrative distances us from Ozymandias himself and emphasizes how little of his once great power remains, because only secondhand stories and ruins have survived the passage of time, without which we'd probably never even know that he existed. This is one way that Shelley uses language to get across his message, but one of the most powerful techniques used is irony. Ozymandias' boastful declaration on the base of the statue is the central feature of the poem. "Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." But this is sharply contrasted by the abrupt sentence immediately after, "Nothing beside remains." The reality is that none of his works have stood the test of time, and this is emphasized by the language which focuses on the ruin of the statue. Phrases like shattered visage, colossal wreck, and half sunk paint a vivid picture of its destruction and decay, but also has associations to a sunken ship, particularly when it is paired with the image of the lone and level sands stretching around like an ocean. The sand itself could also be seen to represent two ideas. One, as a symbol of the sands of time, a figure of speech which means that time is short and slipping away, like sand falling through an hourglass. And two, that nature will be around long after us or the things we build. Shelley uses alliteration to reinforce this idea, with boundless and bare, and lone and level, highlighting how vast and unchanging the surrounding landscape is. This leads us to our first theme, which is the power of humans versus the power of time and nature. Ozymandias declared himself king of kings, and in his time he probably was, but even he is no match for the unstoppable passage of time, as all that remains of his mighty empire is a ruined statue surrounded by endless desert, which will far outlast even the ruin. As we know, Shelley was very critical of arrogant rulers who believed their power would last forever, and so he portrays Ozymandias in a very unflattering way, using language like wrinkled, frown, sneer, and cold to emphasize his tyranny. All that power only inflated his hubris, meaning that he was overly proud and confident, as we can see from his inscription where he taunts and warns other mighty rulers to look on my works and despair. There's more irony here, as instead of prompting despair at his awe-inspiring greatness, the statue now provokes us to think about his downfall and unfounded arrogance. Notice that both the words works and mighty are capitalized, which links them together and makes them stand out. Shelley is implying that both the works of man and the so-called mighty or powerful might seem like they are important, but are really so temporary, which is why the word wreck is also capitalized later on. Many of these same ideas are shared in other poems from the anthology, particularly the themes of power and pride. Robert Browning's My Last Duchess is a great example of this, as both explore the unfounded arrogance of powerful rulers. Ozymandias boasts through the inscription on his statue, while the Duke boasts through his monologue about his 900-year-old name. Both rulers are obsessed with a kind of narcissistic self-love, with the Duke constantly praising himself in this poem, while Ozymandias is written in sonnet form, a style of poetry usually reserved for love and courtship. They are also both revealed to be tyrannical and controlling with those whom they have power over, as Ozymandias' sneer of cold command and hand that mocked are highlighted, while the Duke's commands caused his wife's smiles to stop altogether. However, their power and pride is critiqued in both poems, and their arrogance comes across as foolish rather than intimidating. You can also compare Shelley's emphasis on the power of nature with several other poems, like Seamus Heaney's Storm on the Island, which illustrates how nature is impossible to tame or predict, and will always overpower human attempts at control. This idea also features in William Wordsworth's The Prelude, which highlights nature's incredible power to humble man, and how insignificant we are in comparison, much like how Shelley shows nature humbling even the mightiest of kings. No matter what poem you compare it to, however, Ozymandias' message is very similar to many of the anthology's core ideas, that human power, whether it be political or personal, is often fragile and fleeting, and it is memory, art, and nature that remain. If you want to see more videos on the Power and Conflict anthology, let me know which poems I should do next in the comments. See you next time!